Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first in a series of 6 presentations by doctoral and Rothman Fellows from the UF Center for Humanities and the Public Sphere. I am Sheila Dickerson, facilitator for today's session. I'm standing in for Rick Gold, who is out of town. Okay, very good. I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Jamie Ahlberg, who will tell you about the Center for Humanities in the Public Sphere. She will also describe upcoming programs and then introduce you to today's presenter. Dr. Jamie Ahlberg is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere. She completed her PhD in philosophy at the University of Wisconsin in 2010, at which time she joined UF. Her research explores how ideals like equality and fairness come to bear on everyday policy and practice, particularly in the realms of education, medicine, the family, and politics. She teaches and supervises both undergraduate and graduate students working in moral philosophy, political philosophy, and applied ethics. She became director of the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere in the fall of 2023, and since then has started both a digital humanities initiative and the Alexander Grass Scholars Program, which offers undergraduate project-based research opportunities in the humanities. Jamie.
Thank you, Sheila, for that introduction, and thank you for having me. Welcome to all of you here and to all of you who are joining us remotely or will join us remotely in the future. Before I open the session, yours up a little. Thank you. Before I open the session and introduce our speaker, I just wanted to say a few words about the center. It started in 2005 and really was founded in order to support 3 interrelated aims. The first is to facilitate and support the research programs of the humanists who are at UF doing research. Then it was to provide a physical and intellectual hub for collaborative and critical conversations about humanities-related topics. And lastly, to engage with the community within which we live and teach. So I think this program in particular is a great example of how we're meeting several of those aims in one program. So please be on the lookout for additional programming that we'll offer for the upcoming academic year. We're going to publish that pretty soon, right around the beginning of fall, and in particular, our speaker series, which is going to be focused on the digital humanities. And we're going to publish our list of speakers very soon. That will be, our first speaker will be in September. Our website is humanities.ufl.edu, and on there you can sign up for our weekly agenda. I'll put that up probably maybe in our last session. Just make sure you have everything you need to get up to speed on what it is we're going to be providing this year. Absolutely, I'll be very happy to do that. Thank you. So today I'm pleased to open this year's Center for Humanities in the Public Sphere's Learning in Retirement course, which is called Emerging Research in the Humanities. It explores ongoing cutting-edge research in the humanities at UF by featuring speakers who have recently won fellowships with the center. I'd like to thank the Margaret and Robert Rothman Endowment and the Tedder Family Endowed Research Fund for making possible both these faculty and doctoral student fellowships. I also wanted to take a moment to pause and say a word about the question of what humanities research is. So we say it's about emerging research in the humanities. Those of us who even have professional humanities backgrounds find it difficult to define humanities and humanities research. One way to think about it is that what we do is we explore the question, what does it mean to be a human being? So humanists think about understanding, evaluating, communicating human experiences, human values, aspirations to improve the human condition. And through comparative and global study, which we'll hear about today, humanities scholars foster in students and communities, I think, a critical concern for civic and moral responsibility. While humanities have traditionally flourished in the disciplines of history and philosophy, literatures and languages, they really inform every inquisitive endeavor. And I think this series will attest to that because we'll have a variety of talks on a variety of topics. Our speaker today is Edelweiss Murillo Lafuente, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology and Criminology and Law. She's a sociology researcher and transnational feminist with a certificate from the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at the University of Florida. She earned her MA in sociology at the University of Toledo in Ohio and her bachelor's degree in communication studies at the Bolivian Catholic University in La Paz, Bolivia, which is also where she was born. Her research focuses on anti-ableist feminist movements in the global South. Some of her recent publications include Spaces of Anti-Ableist Feminist Resistance, Knitting and Autoethnography in Global Feminist Autoethnographies during COVID-19, Disfeminicide, Conceptualizing the Feminicides of Women and Girls with Disabilities. A belief in kindness and social change motivate her work. Her talk today presents her research on how women with disabilities in Latin America organize and resist what has been called multi-sided violence and advocate for their rights as citizens when those rights are consistently violated due to ableist discrimination and gender inequality. She explores how state violence operates against women with disabilities and then looks at collective resistance against that state violence through activism and art by focusing on specifically the case of women with disabilities in Bolivia. She conducted 2 years of field work to investigate how Bolivian women with disabilities use art and activism to resist violence and demand full citizenship. I'm confident that you're going to find that her research serves as an important intervention in scholarship on social movements, disability studies, and gender violence. So please help me to welcome Edelweiss.
Thanks, Jamie, and everyone here. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. My name is Edelweiss, and I'm almost 6 months pregnant, just to tell you a little bit about me, and I will be graduating next year, so I'm very happy to be sharing my work with you all. Let me adjust this. There we go. Okay. So I will be sharing parts of my dissertation and the work that I've been doing and the research that I've been conducting for over 2 years now. And I will share one part of my research, but I will also include some other pieces of what I've been doing. But before I do so, well, I will introduce the overall topic, which is women with disabilities, participation in social movements, and I do look at a specific case study in Bolivia. But before we go into all of that, I would like to start this conversation by asking, oh, thank you. Moving to the next slide. And just making an outline of what we're going to do. I will be talking about some important concepts like ableism, multi-sided violence, and legal violence. Then I will share what methodology I've been using, mostly ethnography, and I will be presenting cases of legal violence. Then I will move on into intersectional activism and what does this mean? Share a very brief conclusion, and then we will have time for some questions and discussions. So I would like to ask you all if anyone knows what is ableism. Any idea? I see some heads shaking. Yes. Yes, Thank you so much, Christina. That's a very straightforward. Yes, so Christina just mentioned that it's the discrimination against people with disabilities, intentional or non-intentional, against disabled people. And I do have a couple of videos that are available in the presentation for whoever wants to get the presentation later. And here I share another definition that's based on what Christina just mentioned. So ableism is the discrimination and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. At its heart, ableism is rooted in the assumption that disabled people require fixing and defines people by their disability. Like racism and sexism, ableism classifies entire groups of people as less than and includes harmful stereotypes, misconceptions, and generalizations of people with disabilities. And we can think about how are people with disabilities portrayed on TV shows and movies, for example, or how do we use some a language referring to people with disabilities as insults. And it might also be connected to ageism, what has been called the discrimination based on age. Another important concept that I will be talking about is multi-sided violence. So we all know what violence means. And we can think about physical violence as something that hurts people. But in this case, Cecilia Menjivar proposed this concept to talk about a context in which various forms of violence, such as structural, political, everyday violence, symbolic, and gender violence coexist simultaneously. Adamson and other scholars argue that the gap between violence against women laws and their implementation can be explained through the degree and type of multi-sided violence exercised in different contexts. For example, in settings where a broader spectrum and diverse forms of multi-sided violence prevail, often accompanied by a more intense manifestations of such violence, a broader implementation gap is expected. So this means that in some countries we have very innovative laws protecting women. However, the reality is that women are not protected. The implementation gap refers to the discrepancy between the laws officially recorded and their practical enforcement. And this is what I've been looking in the case that I study. Particularly, I do look into legal violence. So legal violence denotes situations where laws and their enforcement give rise to actions that cause harm to individuals, whether it be physical, economic, psychological, or emotional, meaning that instead of protecting, these laws end up harming the people that they are supposed to protect. While a significant amount of scholarly attention is directed toward examining the motives for violence at the individual level, we end up often looking at what characteristics does an aggressor have, or what are the personal characteristics of victims. Menjivar and Walsh examined the social legal environment and the current legal codes that contribute to an ongoing failure to provide sufficient responses to violence against women in Guatemala. I was lucky enough to meet with Cecilia Menjivar in a scholar meeting, and I asked if I could use her framework that she developed for Guatemala to look at what was happening in Bolivia. And she said that that's what theory is made for, to apply in different contexts. So I did. The picture that I'm showing right here is part of the public art that is showed in the streets of La Paz, Bolivia. It says more than 39,000 law denounces of violence from January to November in 2021. And this is just part of the data that has been collected of cases of violence against women. So my research asks how women with disabilities in Latin America organize to resist what has been called multi-sided violence and advocate for their rights as citizens within a context where these rights are constantly violated due to discrimination based on ableism and gender inequality. Bolivian women with disabilities are a target of legal violence, and they resist legal violence through feminist social movement organizations and intersectional praxis. The situation of women with disabilities in the Global South has largely been ignored in scholarly conversations, feminist activist organizations, and public policies to prevent violence against women. Sadly, the reality between the Global South and the Global North is not that different. For another article, I reviewed bases of feminicide, murder against women because of their gender. And in countries in the Global South and in the Global North, there was not enough data about disability status. So I do specify my work in the Global South, but it's not that different from the Global North. So this research concerns the political strategies that members of an anti-ableist feminist collective organization in Bolivia conduct. I describe the political agency women with disabilities exercise within a context where human rights are violated, and I use the theoretical framework that I already presented of multi-sided violence. Some of the art that I will be presenting, like this one, is part of the art activism that the members of this organization, Femidiscas, has done to raise awareness on, first, the existence of women with disabilities and also of their political power. You will notice that there's a lot of fire in their art. For example, here, and in the first one that was present here, that is also part of the art that was created to raise awareness of the existence and problematics that women with disabilities face. So, I want to talk a little bit about methodology. I used ethnographic fieldwork and participatory action research throughout 2 years, from 2021 to 2023. And I argue that ethnographic methods are appropriate for studying state violence and collective resistance because ethnographic involvement allows for capturing data that includes structural perspectives and individual worldviews. Paraway, and scholar, argues that extended case studies are necessary to make connections between everyday life and extra-local contexts. So, I will share some pictures of my ethnographic journey, like this one that translate to say, fight like a cholita, which is an indigenous woman. And with this soul image, we get to have more information, maybe, than me explaining all of the context where Bolivia's indigenous population, that is more than 60%, has gained popularity and proud in their indigenous or our indigenous roots. So why ethnography? I chose ethnography and specifically audiovisual ethnography because it captures more than words. And when I'm translating from a country that speaks mainly Spanish, but also Aymara, Quechua, Guarani, and more than 30 indigenous languages, translating into English becomes very limited. So capturing some of the images might also make the study richer and easier to understand to other people. This is one of the graffitis that we can find in the city of La Paz that says, "Mothering is political," from Rita Segato, an Argentinian scholar. And next to it, there was an image of the Virgin in the middle of the street that takes care of the streets. This makes sense to understand when we think about a country like Bolivia, which is in the middle of South America, where most of its population is Catholic and respects Virgin Mary. So I specifically use a feminist participatory action research ethnography. Very long name to explain the work. But what it entails is to take a personal stand on what is happening and not to only observe, but to also be part of what is happening. So that's where the participatory action part takes place. I did not only go to Bolivia to look at what was happening, but I got involved and also helped with some of the activist work that was being done. Some of these pictures, for example, were taken in the Pride, during Pride in Bolivia, where LGBTQ activists united with women with disabilities activists and participated together in the parade to raise awareness not only of violence against one population, but both. The picture on the graffiti side, so I'm just gonna turn here, says any party, any political party are fascists. So and it is part of another feminist organization representing their political stance. Other examples of how pictures capture more than words when we go about doing ethnography are shown here. This is, for example, the big picture is one of the two rooms in which one of the women with disabilities activists lives. So that's her living room, dining room, study area, and kitchen. She lives with her two 3-year-old, and she's currently finishing her master's in philosophy. So apart from working in an office, she also studies and does activist work. And you can see how many things we have in this room that also represents how her life is being conducted. A part of all of the activist work, she also has the study and the work and the motherhood aspect of her life. This is the image on the top is one of the streets of La Paz. You can see that it's a mountain full of stairs, and somehow people with disabilities, with physical disabilities, also live in these streets. So how do they do it? For example, wheelchair users. It's a mystery, but it happens. And finally, the picture at the bottom is the meeting that Las Feministas, or the organization that I followed, had 2 years ago. So basically, doing ethnography in this kind of work makes sense. This is part of the street art that one can see when visiting the city of La Paz in Bolivia. And this is the police station where I spent a lot of days following cases of violence and looking at how women with disabilities were being treated by police officers and also in legal courts. So some of the challenges of doing ethnographic works is that you can get a lot of data, sometimes too much data, and that it's very hard to decide what to do with it. one of the writings that I had that I revised, that I had written a lot about, was how heavy it was to push wheelchairs, with wheelchair users through the streets of La Paz, because they are all ups and downs. And I didn't know what to do. And someone said, you could write an entire article about this. So I'm not doing that just yet about embodied ethnography, but this is just an example. The two other pictures are in police stations, where I also spend a lot of time and end up getting a lot of information about the mistreatment that women officers get within the police stations. This was not my case study, but it was very interesting. Specifically, for example, I remember the bathroom situation. They said that the bathrooms were not clean and that men police officers did not care about, and they were the ones that were assuming the high ranks. So this was a very interesting problem that I could not write about, but it's there. And then there's too much data for analyzing and writing. This is one of the legal services that a feminist organization provides on your left. And on the right, you will find two flags. The first one represents all of the indigenous groups that has all of the colors with a white in the middle from the Americas. And the one next to it, it's an LGBTQ and plus flag. They were both planted in a very rural area of Bolivia. This is just to represent the diversity, the indigenous, but also sexual orientation diversity that the country holds. So I used ethnographic participatory action research to collect data. My work was motivated by the urgency to transcend discourse as the principal data source in sociology and intervening with direct actions in the material work to work towards social justice. I unpack how legal violence operates and the forms it takes through online and in-person ethnographic involvement. And I used some of the audiovisual participatory methods to do this. So I went to Bolivia and I spent time with victims, with police, with legal court psychologists, social workers, but I also did an accompaniment, a virtual accompaniment through Zoom and phone calls with many of the activists. I do have to say that my positionality as a researcher influenced my fieldwork as a Bolivian woman researcher and a co-founder of the organization too. I have been an active member of the feminist organization Las Feministas since its beginnings in 2021 as an ally. And I have been conducting exploratory research since 2018 in this country, but I've been involved in activism since 2010, or when I was living in Bolivia before coming to do my graduate studies in the US. So throughout this journey, I realized that this was important. I had never seen an organization that was anti-ableist. I didn't even know what ableism meant. And even today, this is a new concept. I have asked around if there are any anti-ableist organizations in Gainesville, for example, and I did not find any. There are some that share values, but not any that identifies itself as anti-ableist. So this is new in Bolivia, in the US, in Europe, and I realized that there was research needed to be done. So Las Feministas is this group, is a grassroots anti-ableist feminist collective organization formed by women with disabilities and allies in March 2021. That was the first time that it officially started. And it was created through the Alliance of Feminists with and without disabilities, because there was a call from feminist networks in Bolivia for contributions to new abortion legislation. So what happened is that Bolivia organization said that we needed to change some legislation around abortion, and women with disabilities said, hold, just wait a minute, we are not being considered. Women with disabilities have always had free abortion. And the struggle is not to get free abortion, like in most places, but instead to stop us having forced abortions. Because a lot of women with disabilities are obligated to have an abortion if they get pregnant because they are supposedly not fit to be mothers. So this was a big problem that was not being considered, and this was the first fire that started this organization. So between these 2 years, I accompanied more than 4 cases of violence, but I will talk about specifically 4 cases of violence against women with disabilities at police stations and legal courts. I also participated in collective meetings and online encounters. I conducted focus group with investigator police officers, interviews with administrators, social workers, psychologists who assist in cases of violence in the special unit to combat violence against women and other governmental institutions. I also documented how police and legal officers treat women with disabilities, and I proposed some changes to build an inclusive legal system at the end. The first case study that I will share with you all happened in the middle of COVID. You can all remember how COVID affected us all, but we can also think about the people who were institutionalized and how psychiatric hospitals were treated during COVID. Some left without food or hygiene items. And in this case, without attention to the case of violence that was happening in the psychiatric institution in La Paz. So in March 2021, amid the pandemic, the regional human rights defender officer issued a public notice informing a case of sexual violence in one of the most prominent psychiatric institutions. Such notice was not surprising given the lack of attention that psychiatric institutions received, and Las Feministas Collective created a document to call attention to this case and raise awareness of psychiatric institutions' violent and abusive management. So through these communications shared via social networks, we could contact the victim, and I interviewed her. She didn't have a clear diagnostic of her health, and she didn't know if she was bipolar or she had another diagnosis. However, she did recall that there was a sexual incident at the psychiatric institution, and for a while they tried to keep up with the legal case, but soon they realized that it was a lot of time, a lot of money, and that it wasn't worth it for them. They were poor, and they didn't have enough resources to continue with this. On the picture, you will see a protest that says, "Stop torturing and raping psychiatric patients," which is something that was not a one-time experience, as we then started to do some more research on these institutions, and we found out that there were a lot more cases that never got to an end. Case 2 happened around the same time. That's a lot of information right there. But I will just tell you that Pat was filing a case against 2 close family members who had physically harmed her, and as a result of this, left her in a wheelchair. So because of her situation with the wheelchair, she could not go to the police offices because they were not accessible. So her mom, an Aymara woman, an indigenous woman, would try to file the case for her. However, her mom didn't speak Spanish fluently, and no one in the court or the police officers had knowledge of this indigenous language, which is very common in this country, Bolivia. So Pat told me that her mother pursued her case, but she sometimes felt discriminated against because she was indigenous and did not speak Spanish fluently. This demonstrates ethnic racial discrimination. Since Bolivia is a plurinational state, is the first plurinational state in the world that recognizes 36 official languages, the police institution fails to provide accessible information in multiple languages so that all individuals are recognized as citizens. When I talked with the police, they said that they sometimes have someone who speaks Aymara or Quechua, but they just call them on demand and they are not hired. Most of the time, these people are part of the cleaning service or the food service workers. And they just do this translation as favors. So this is why they don't have a reliable translator all of the time. The third case has to do with economic violence. I described the case of two women that are filing demands against the father of their children, who after the children were born, just left them alone. So according to Bolivian law, similar to the US, if the father leaves, they have to give a pension to their kids, right? And this was not happening. So they filed this demand, and they are both autonomous or single mothers with disabilities. In this case, women were suing the progenitors of their children because they stopped or never contributed to child support. Precarious conditions push mothers with disabilities to stay in violent relationships, except those who decide to raise their children away from violent environments. This is the situation of Marina and Kim that I present, who went against the usual case of staying in a violent relation because of economic dependency. They are both activists, and they demanded through different paths. So during one of my interviews with Kim, she told me, Bolivian justice is very expensive. This is why anyone going through the system needs to pay favors. And in this way, pursue the legal route to justice. Otherwise, the public prosecutors will not even consider the case. Institutionalized corruption is part of the legal system in this country. This means that regardless of the propaganda that assures that no one should pay a penny to acquire justice, it is necessary to pay prosecutors, administrative staff, and police to complete the cycle of bureaucracy. Kim's frustration with the legal system is also felt in her body. During the same interview, she said, all of this legal process is making my body ache. I think about it and my back, my head start hurting. So this is where we can see how theory meets with reality. Remember when I talked about the gap between laws and their implementation, and how sometimes laws can harm the people they're supposed to protect? This is how. So instead of finding a relief through justice, women who decide to go within the justice route end up not feeling only psychologically overwhelmed, but also finding their bodies hurting, aching, right? Not only their head, but also their knees because of walking or waiting or making the long lines. So looking at the Bolivian case allows us to understand that even though there are legal protections that women are denouncing violence in their lives, the implementation of these laws reproduces violence and creates economic and physical obstacles that harm women with disabilities. Intersectionality, works as a practical framework that guides coalition in the activist work of Las Feministas. And at the same time, it could work as analytical framework to understand the necessary accommodations in legal instances for women searching for justice. So I'm using intersectionality in two ways. First, to look at the potential that working in groups has, not only, for example, for women with disabilities, but for women with disabilities to look out and search for other groups or activist groups who may offer legal assistance, like in this case. This is one of the offices of feminist legal services provided for free, the only one in the country. And the graffiti inside of the building says, woman, to be free, love yourself. And the second way that intersectionality could be used also is to give a framework to the police and to legal courts to understand the situation of women with disabilities. There has been cases where police does not have a translator for Bolivian Sign Language or an interpreter for Bolivian Sign Language. So if a deaf woman comes, they just won't take her case because they cannot understand her. And the same thing happens with women with intellectual disabilities. When they interview or they want to make the report and the woman is not talking with the speed that they are supposed to talk, then they just dismiss her case. There are other examples of this happening, and having an intersectional understanding that everyone has different needs and that there are certain intersections that need to be considered would make the police and the legal court work more accessible. So some of the conclusions is that the experiences of this collective contribute to theories on intersectional activism because they amplify the discussion of different forms of coalition between social movements and organizations. At the same time, these experiences contribute to the social movement literature on coalition building. How do we build coalition? How do we build bigger movements? Through my ethnographic work, I identified threats and opportunities that precipitate the formation of movement alliances. In the 4 cases of violence that I presented, I witnessed the factors that impede coalition work, included a lack of resources to maintain steady conversation and communication channels between members of Las Feministas and other feminist organizations or the state legal apparatus. And these resources included time, money, and bodily energy. So thanks to the Rothman Fellowship, I was granted some funds to go to Bolivia and do this work. I spent some of these funds living in La Paz, but also accompanying these cases. So these time, money, and my bodily energy resources helped finish some of the cases. For example, the 2 that were about economic violence, they are one of the few cases that had a positive ending, where they finished the case and then they had the notice to get paid or send the fathers or of the children to jail. And I think that if we continue doing this type of research that involves with reality and with the people, then we can besides getting great academic work, we can also get interventions within reality that are important for people who are living their lives. These are some QR codes to the information of the organization, Las Feministas. And the picture here is from another protest that says, I protest because I am alive and I don't know until when. So this is part of the reality that a lot of women with disabilities face. And just as a reminder, most of the people with disabilities live in the global south worldwide. So we do have people with disabilities living all over in every country, but most of them are situated in the global south. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. But this is it. I do have some questions to finish my presentation that are for the public. So just to think about, what examples of ableism can you think of? How similar or different do you think the situation of women with disabilities is in Bolivia and the USA? And would you be interested in conducting ethnography? What topic would you choose? Just having this brief introduction into ethnographic work. That being said, I think that's my last slide. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Edelweiss. I know you put in a lot of work, and I'm sure people have a lot of questions and things they'd like to talk about with you. So I think we'll start the Q&A session now.
Okay, I have the microphone, and who'd ever like to ask a question, please let me know. Well, I have a question, and that is there any kind of conflict of interest between if you're doing academic research and activism, and that is that you're active yourself in one of these organizations? I wondered if you could address that issue.
Yes, great question. And I think it's very challenging to do research in something that you advocate for, like my case. So I did find some challenges. For example, when am I acting as a researcher and when am I acting like an activist? This was a constant question I had to deal. And there were opportunities where people would open up to me and we're just being friends and just talking about their personal stuff. And I needed a lot of ethical guidance to know what information should I incorporate into my research and what information was I supposed to just keep personal. And the same with activist work. Some protests and some meetings were not secret, but were meant to be private. And so I needed to do a lot of verifying with the organization. I do translate summaries of the research I do and share it with them. And sometimes they don't want some pieces of it to be published or to be in my work. So I respect this. And I think this is one of the first steps to consider.
Thank you, Sheila, for asking that question, because this was a question of mine as well. I think there are some people who would assert that it's legitimate to have a category called a scholar activist. And I'm just it was interesting to me that in your response to Sheila just now, you separated these. You said, well, sometimes I'm a scholar and I have my scholar hat, and sometimes I'm an activist and I have my activist hat. And you resisted the temptation to put this together into one coherent category that could have a unified set of rules or practices around it. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that and whether you think it really is possible to separate your scholarship from your activism and take off a hat and put on a different one. And if you could say more about, in particular, things like how your positionality there informs how you formulate research questions, whether you would not address certain research questions or certain conclusions or certain objections because they wouldn't, the scholarship there might not enhance the activist goals, or where the tension, so you brought up tensions with respect to how you talk to your research subjects, but I wonder whether there are even bigger questions about how you frame the research questions, or whether some research is off limits, or how you feel about that kind of thing.
Oh, well, I think that it's impossible really to, with anything in life, dealing with the roles that we have and the hats that we use, it's very different to be like, okay, right now I am an activist, right now I'm a researcher, just like with any identification we hold. Because at the end of the day, I'm still the same person. However, I do try to make this difference and to find the limits on what was I supposed to write about. But although I do have it informs me, the theoretical background that informs me of what should I be looking at. It was very important for me too, as an activist, to know what was it important for the population I was working with. So for example, there were very big and broad research topics that I wanted to see, like violence, right? That's the one that I did, but also about sexuality, for example. And this is something I did not study because I realized that I could have prepared my questions and go into the field and try to make it. But since this was much more, not much more, but in this case, it was a more delicate topic that would have taken many years to do, and I only had so many years of funding. So in this case, I realized, okay, what can I do to get my my education and my PhD going, but also that is meaningful for the women that I am working with. So I think this was another tension, and I'm happy to say now that the group found funding to do a research on sexuality, and they are doing a project right now, and I am helping with the process. So I am still involved, and this will not, sadly, it won't elevate my CV because it's not academic English public published work, but it will be published in Bolivia and in Spanish. So I know that it's going to be important for the people who work with. And even though it's not going to be part of my PhD journey, like formally, I know that it's worth it and that it's important work. So this is, for example, my activism meets with my research skills because I am conducting activism, but giving advice on how to do these research questions and how to do the interviews, even though I'm not going to do the interviews, they are. And it's going to be the second research that the organization is making, and it's very new because it's made by women with disabilities for women with disabilities. So in this case, I identify myself as an ally, and I'm just providing support, not really leading the research.
I just want to add that Rick Gold, one of our original facilitators who can't be with us today, would probably thank you and share that this is so impressive and what a great contribution that you're doing. And thank you for your presentation. But he also consults and advocates for women in the Middle East and Asia. And he might wonder, are you inspiring others to continue this research in other parts of the world or in other areas?
Oh, that would be great. So at the moment I am applying for research positions for once I graduate my PhD, and they ask you to elaborate a plan of your next steps in research. And one of my next steps is looking at transnational connections of anti-ableist activism. I am starting in the Americas because I've seen already the connections that there are between Bolivia, Mexico, Argentina, for example, who are developing a lot of this type of work. But I've also read, unfortunately, I don't know the authors, but I've read a lot of work that is being done in Vietnam with photo elicitation, activism from there, coming from women with disabilities. I am also part of the board of the U.S. Women Caucus that does advocacy at the UN. And some of the work that I've been doing is writing reports about the situation of women with disabilities in the US. And then again, it's sad to know that the situation is not that different. Murders against women with disabilities in the US are still silenced and are still happening. But not only here, but also in Canada. I have a colleague that I worked with, and we looked at these specific cases. And no one is making a record of women with disabilities who are murdered. In fact, some of the legal cases justify the murders, saying that it stopped the pain or it stopped the suffering of having a disability. So this is horrendous. I don't know if you have this information, but in the US, people with disabilities are legally underpaid. And this affects mostly women with disabilities because they cannot even aspire or get a minimum wage. They are legally receiving below the minimum wage, and this is a fight that it's been going on here in the US. Yes.
Thank you for bringing that up because I knew that from my little sister. When you apply for disability benefits, you cannot have a certain amount in your bank account, otherwise they will be taken from you. So with her, we had lost my father, a couple years ago, and he had left some money for her. And our concern was, what are we going to do? We have to make sure that this is not sitting in her account because then she's going to lose access to everything. So it is very much a problem. And then I don't want to, redirect, but I have a question also about sort of, navigating the space of, you talked about that you spent a lot of time around the police department, and you've talked a bit about some of the discrimination taking place there against women and against disabled women. And I guess, how did you approach that as a woman researcher? And did you experience any obstacles in that way when you were trying to conduct your research also?
Oh, yes, that's a great question. Thanks, Christine. And also, another situation before I forget, in the US, there's discrimination based on marriage. If a disabled person gets married, they stop getting the benefit of disability. So there's a lot of people who do not get married because they need the financial support provided by the social welfare. Regarding the question about police, that was a very big piece in my mind when I was making this. In fact, at first I didn't want to look or work with police because it's very scary for me to work with police, and especially with police officer men. Because I know that there's a very sexist culture in Latin America. It's different how it's experienced in Latin America than in the US, but I did not want to work with men police officers. So I wrote in my proposal that I would only interview women police officers. And then my plan kind of didn't work because I realized that officers that were conducting the cases of violence were also men. So I could not ignore this, and I interviewed them, and I made sure that I always had a big long coat and that my appearance looked like if I was older too. I did use a little bit more makeup and try to look more serious, just to avoid any bad experience. And I did have a lot of good experiences working with women police officers, and they opened up and talked about this discrimination that they live within the police department. And that was very nice for me because I would always say, oh, the police is just this one homogeneous thing, when that's not the reality. There's a lot of experiences.
So Julianne, do we have any online questions? Okay, and do we have anyone else with a question? Because I've got one last question. Oh, Shirley, go ahead.
Hi, I was just interested in some of the artistic representation that you shared in your presentation, such as this recurring image of the fire. And also, I noticed that there's like a kind of a mermaid theme in some of the artwork. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to your choice to examine art-based activism and what some of those symbols might mean in the context of the work you're doing.
Thank you. So when I started this project, I did not want to deal with sad things. I did not want to look at violence because I thought that this was already being looked at. And I decided to look at the activism, the positive work that this group was doing. Soon I realized that I could not look at the activism without looking at the bad part. Why are they resisting? Are they experiencing? So this part is, I will say, like the bad part that I'm showing you, the important one though, that talks about violence. And the other part of my research looks specifically at the activism based in art, or artivism that has been called, and how do these women create this art. So there's been a lot of activities. For example, together we organized the first art exhibition in La Paz that showcased disability. We made a contest and we had more than 50 art pieces that portrayed disability. So a sculpture, painting, video, photography were sent, and then there was a judge board and they chose 4 winning pieces. In one of the chapters of my dissertation, I look into these pieces. Songs were written and presented too. And these are very small or unnoticeable ways to raise awareness into problems of discrimination, of violence, that are not often visible in news media, for example. And the first representation of the organization was a mermaid with 2 tails, because there was a theme going that I'm not sure if it has to do with indigenous Bolivian indigenous worldviews, but people with disabilities are usually connected to the strike and the um, thunder, to thunder. So they say that people with disabilities have been touched by a thunder at some point. And I don't know how this connects to the mermaid aesthetic, but it has been used in more than one image, as you've noticed. Fire was one that the members talked about, and how nakedness also shows the political agency of women, because usually women with disabilities are not shown as sexy or as having sexuality at all. So making these paintings where they are naked was an empowerment move for this group. And having the fire, it also meant that they had some kind of power in their hands and that they were lighting up an activism. So those are a few of the aspects that I looked at.
Okay, just this one last quick question, and that is, as an activist, I'm finding it hard to imagine that you're not overwhelmed by the scale of the problem, the size of the problem, the diffusion of the problem. How do you keep from being just totally overwhelmed by the work that needs to be done?
Oh, tired. Tired, and sometimes with my heart aching after hearing some of the violence experiences. It's very different from doing other types of research that I've done in the past, where you just transcribe the interview and then it's ready for coding. This one, sometimes I would just keep thinking and also talking with the person besides research. And I think it's a skill and something about self-care that I've learned in this journey of how to let go of certain things, but also not let go of others. I did have to take a long break after the final field work I did and just disconnect. And the members of the collective were very understanding. I also, they were very respectful of my pregnancy too. They said that they were the first ones to say that I should take a break and maybe not talk to any of them for a while. And now I am returning to communication for this new project, but it's been a very needed break that I had.
Well, thank you, Edelweiss, for a really fascinating and provocative talk. We really appreciate your doing it. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheila.